Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. 250 years ago in Chelsea, a bit quieter then than it is now, an 8-year-old boy's instrument practice began to annoy the neighbours. So, instead of playing music, he decided to write some instead. The opening bars of Mozart's First Symphony, early evidence of a prodigiously creative talent. What exactly do we mean by creativity, though? What balance of the familiar and the new, of rule-following and rule-breaking, of organisation and disorganisation, marks out the genuinely creative mind? That's what we're talking about this morning, as well as how to keep even the least creative mind focused on the job at hand. With us to help are Maggie Boden, a professor of cognitive science who uses computers to better understand human creativity, Ian Page, artistic director of classical opera, and the poet Francis Leviston, an advocate and beneficiary of creative serendipity. We begin, though, with Daniel Levitin, professor of psychology, behavioural neuroscience and music at McGill University in Canada, and the author of The Organised Mind. Your book, Daniel, begins with this idea: the need for paying attention to how we pay attention is greater than ever. Why?
Well, Tom, I think we all feel as though we're being asked to do more than ever before, and that we're being bombarded by information and tasks that weren't in our lives before. Just as an example, we take in 175 times the equivalent of 175 newspapers every day, 5 times more information than we did in 1986 every day. We are living in a world with 300 exabytes of human-made information. That's a 300 with 18 zeros after it. Google estimates there were only 30 exabytes just a few years ago. So in the last few years, we've created more information than in all of human history before us.
Of course, that information is all there potentially. We don't have to pay attention to it all, do we?
But it does bombard us. It does seem to come at us from all different sides. And so you're exactly right. I think the key to navigating this fire hose of information is to get out of the mainstream of it and somehow take what you need, but not get knocked over by the rest of it.
And one of the points of your book is that the decision-making networks in your brain don't distinguish between really important decisions and really trivial ones, that they're not quite up to making that distinction. So we have to find some other way of sorting that out. Is that right?
That's exactly right, Tom. So it's not that your brain doesn't know the difference between an important decision and an unimportant one, but your neurons, which are doing the work, use up about the same amount of energy making a trivial decision as an important one. There was a very clever experiment done where people were asked to make a bunch of trivial decisions. You come into the laboratory, you're going to fill out a questionnaire. Do you want to use a green pen or a blue pen? Oh, we've got some gum. Do you want spearmint or peppermint? And, oh, by the way, we can give you the test on white paper or on yellow paper. After a series of these different trivial questions, people open the packet and they're asked to make very important decisions. Suppose you have cancer. Here's the outline of a treatment course of radiation versus surgery, and it's rigged so that one choice is clearly better than the other. The people who had been put through these trivial decisions did much worse at making an important decision because they had literally depleted neural resources necessary for good decision-making. We call it decision fatigue.
That's one of the essential points, isn't it? There's an economy here. All of these little tiny brain activities cost.
Yes.
They cost in energy. Now, could you imagine, just to explain the mechanism of that, if you imagine a listener now at home trying to concentrate on this programme, what mechanisms permit that and what is happening in the brain chemistry to allow that to happen?
Well, at the lowest level, it's important to recognize that neurons are living cells with a metabolism. They need energy to function. That energy is generally in the form of glucose. And the neurons burn glucose like your car burns petrol, and there's a limited supply of it. You talk about neurochemicals. There's a number of different chemicals that mediate proper thinking and clear thinking. One of them is dopamine, which helps us to pay attention and to stay on task. People who have a dopamine deficiency are said to have attention deficit disorder, and they can't focus on something. Our listeners, who are either driving or working or sitting at home, are surrounded by a world of distraction. There's the sound of the heater in the background. There might be cars honking outside, sirens, people talking in another room. The brain has to sort through all of these competing signals and effectively filter them out and pay attention to us talking, we hope. And attention is a limited capacity resource. We can't actually balance all these things at once. We have to filter, or otherwise we're overloaded.
Now, a particularly contemporary story that's told about this is, well, that's just multitasking. And in fact, you can get better at it. And, you know, that's one of the great skills of modern life, is to become a multitasker so that you can, you know, pay attention to the road if you're driving and listen to this programme and listening to us talk. You seem to think that multitasking is a bit of a myth. Or
it is a myth. It's one of the great myths of modern society, because brains don't work that way. There's now adequate evidence from neuroscientific studies by Earl Miller at MIT and many others. You're not actually doing 4 or 5 things at once. Instead, the brain is rapidly shifting from one thing to the next, allocating maybe a few seconds of attention over here and then a few seconds of attention over there. You end up fractionating your attention, and at the end of the day, you haven't saved time, you've wasted time. Now, the interesting part of this is that we all feel so strongly that we're good at it. But as a neuroscientist, I can tell you one thing that the brain is very good at is self-delusion. So just because we think we're good at it doesn't make it so.
You suggest there's another mechanism here too, though, that there is a little reward for these micro tasks completed, so that when we check our email, we think we've done something, we think we've achieved something, we get a little mental reward for that. I mean, you go as far as saying that it's addictive. Now, I think you don't mean that as a metaphor, do you?
I don't. So
Could you just explain that?
Our ancestors developed novelty detectors, Tom. This would have been a good thing to have as hunter-gatherers, a new source of food, a new well, a new source of mates, to be able to tend to those. What we evolved was a reward mechanism. You learn something new, you get a little shot of dopamine, which makes you feel good. It's the so-called feel-good hormone in the brain. So every time we read a new email or see a new thumbs up on Facebook or send out a new tweet, these are novel activities. They give us this little shot of dopamine. Dopamine is highly addictive. It's the chemical that is being manipulated when people are addicted gamblers or drug users. A colleague of mine did a famous experiment in the 50s. He put rats in a cage, and if they pressed a bar, they'd get, through an electrode implanted in their brains, a little shot of dopamine. And what do you think the rats did? They pressed the bar over and over and over again. They gave up eating, they gave up sleeping and having sex. They pressed the bar until they died. And if that repetitive pressing of the bar and this dopamine addiction loop reminds you of somebody compulsively checking email...
Hasn't there been some questioning of that experiment, just on the basis that when it was done with rats that had an interesting and rich environment, the effect was nowhere near as marked? It was very marked in rats that were in, as it were, stark cages. But as soon as you gave them other interesting things to do, they did the other interesting things rather than just press the lever.
You've really done your homework. Yes, that's absolutely right. And so that's part of the key to how we can navigate the world, is to have other things to do besides checking email.
Just before we kind of open it out, how do we correct? How do we begin to correct? Because it's obviously quite a large task if we've got all of this bombardment of information coming in. What's the best way in which we can, as it were, get back to sort of mental focus?
One of the things I did in preparing the Organized Mind is I shadowed a number of very successful, highly successful people in various domains. Artists, poets, musicians, scientists, some Nobel Prize winners, government leaders, cabinet members in the U.S., military people. And one thing that they all did, which has a neuroscientific basis, is they prioritized explicitly. A lot of us, I think, when we show up to work, we sit down and we work on whatever's there in front of us. But they explicitly took stock twice a day of what was on their to-do list and then reordered things, rejiggered things, so that the most important things were done at the beginning of the day when all those decision-making resources aren't depleted. And the beauty of that, Tom, is that when you've prioritized properly, you sit down at 10 o'clock to work on the Penske file. You know that that's exactly what you should be doing. You're not distracted by other things because you know that there's a time and place for them.
So you externalise a lot of the things that were in your head. You put them out into the world and make them concrete. I mean, my problem always when I do that is I then get distracted by the to-do list, but that's a larger order problem. Margaret Boden, do you recognise this account of the mind as increasingly under siege from
Very
information?
much, very much. And I must say, speaking personally, I try and keep away from the internet as much as I can. I mean, it's hugely useful and so on, but it's also very seductive. And yes, you need to prioritise and concentrate on one thing. So, for example, I do my writing in the morning. I'm absolutely fiendishly defensive, about protecting my time in the mornings. Leave my emails until the afternoon sometimes. In fact, if I'm working well all day, I don't even look at my emails at all until the next day or even the day after if things are going really well.
Ian Page, do you outsource your organisation? You have you're just about to start a 27-year-long musical programme, which the mind boggles at the thought of the organisation involved in that. You externalise it, do you?
Can one buy tickets for the entire series?
No, not every event is on sale just yet. It is a tricky one. I mean, I find I absolutely relate to the sort of to-do lists and the dividing up and the fierce protection of time. I think is really crucial. At the same time, I do sometimes. I mean, as well as being artistic director, my main role is as a conductor, and quite often that full-time occupation feels something that I fit in once the kids have gone to bed. So it's a struggle to maintain that hierarchy. And of course, there are always people that want answers by yesterday. That's another of the big things with email. The expectations of how we source people's requirements is much stronger.
Francis Leviston, you speak up on behalf of disorganisation, don't you? I mean, that it's important not to tidy things up too much if you're to have a rich and creative mind.
Yes, I mean, speaking as a poet, I find disorganisation is actually incredibly important for me. If I come to write a poem and I've already organised my ideas and I have an organised brain, I find that there's really nothing for the poem to do. I mean, writing a poem is an act of rhetorical and emotional organisation, and if you decide what you want to do and plan what you want to say before you come to write it, there's really nothing to be discovered in the writing process. So in order to begin a poem, I feel like what I need really is a kind of primordial soup of thoughts where various ideas and impulses and feelings are bumping against each other and being thrown into new configurations.
But there must presumably be some borderline. I mean, soup alone won't do it, will it? Something's got to float to the surface in the soup, and something's got to have salience within that.
Absolutely.
How do you think that process works?
Oh gosh, I think you find that there's something that emerges as being kind of imaginatively urgent in some way, and it will start to gather other ideas to it. It sort of hangs there as like a catalyst, and other ideas start to collect, and then the sentences start to form. But at that point, it's hard to describe, because I would go into what I know Daniel describes in his book as the flow state, where you're really unconscious in a way of what you're doing. And you emerge at the other end with this poem written, or this piece of music written, and you're not really quite sure how it happened. And that's because the intensity of concentration is so great, and that single-minded focus on what you're doing is so great that you become self-forgetful.
Could you just read us a little bit from your new book, Disinformation? It's from the title poem, I think. If you could just read us the beginning of that, because that might offer us a real-world example of, as it were, the process of a poem coming into being.
Disinformation. I am making jelly for my nephew's 4th birthday party. Any flavour as long as it's red. Bouncy cubes snipped and stirred into hot water in a cloudy Pyrex dish. Rediscovering the secret of isinglass, or is it horse gelatin? While a radio announcer intimates that certain unpopular facts about the operations hitherto repressed, like signs removed from crossroads and bridges in occupied lands, can now be revealed if we just stay tuned.
We like poems about radio on radio, and particularly poems which are about that sort of rather fruitful business of everyday life suddenly having something. But was that the circumstance of how that poem came about? Is it a real circumstance?
No, it's not. I don't have a nephew. It's been a very long time since I've helped to prepare any kind of child's birthday party. So that's one of the things I'm interested in, the ways in which poetry might be considered a type of disinformation in itself. So disinformation being incorrect information that's disseminated deliberately in order to lead people to make certain decisions. Or to experience a certain effect. And we think of it as being a negative thing, and certainly in the political sense we have had a number of instances of that in the last 10, 15 years, particularly in relation to the war in Iraq and so on. You think of the sexed up dossier and so on with regard to the WMDs. But I think disinformation for poets is also an incredibly fruitful and creative thing. There's an American poet called Angie Malinko whose work I'm really interested in. And she came up with this wonderful phrase. She said, "Information, thy nemesis is reverie." And what she's doing there, she's proposing that poetry is some way, the poetry of reverie is in some way categorically different to what we think of as information, that it exists in opposition to the world of information. And reverie and the poems that come from reverie are a different kind of knowledge.
It is dependent on the world of information, isn't it, for its raw material? It has to sort of process. It has to have something to process, and that's where it comes from.
Yeah, definitely. So when I'm writing poems, I do bits of research, but I don't do research in the way that I would research an essay or an article on something. I don't have to be quite that thorough, and certainly not that organised. I'm interested in gappy knowledge, so parts of details about things that catch me, that I find imaginatively stimulating and interesting, but I can't be inhibited by the truth.
We're talking today about creativity as well, and those leaps of creativity. Are you always aware when one's occurred? Are you instantly aware when one's occurred, or does it take time?
Oh, it can happen in both ways. I think sometimes there's an immediate, or perhaps the dopamine, there's an immediate sense of excitement and satisfaction, and you feel that creatively something is happening under your fingers, that you're getting somewhere. And sometimes, you just... That self-delusion can work in both ways. You can think you've done something wonderfully creative and you find out later that it really wasn't. Or you think, something that you wrote just wasn't happening and it wasn't working, and you come back to it maybe a few months later and find that there was the kernel of something actually really important there that you can now tease out in a different way. So it's a very uncertain and volatile activity. And
category untidiness is vital to this, isn't it? I was reading your notes, Margaret, and you quote knitting up the ravelled sleeve of care, the great Shakespearean line. That is disorganisation, isn't it? It's a disorganisation of language in which an abstract noun has suddenly, somehow, got mixed up with concrete nouns. Shouldn't happen, if our world is entirely logical, but something results out of that is absolutely brilliant.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think, Maggie, you talk about this as new combinations. There's one type of creativity is creating new, exciting combinations of ideas, combinations of images. That's something that poets do a lot. I suppose the obvious examples would be something like a simile, where you're comparing something explicitly to something else, and the idea is that the reader hopefully will not have encountered that comparison before, and it will offer you a new way of looking at something. I mean, that's just
I shall compare thee to a somersault.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, they don't always work, do they?
No.
Daniel Levitin, the organised mind, you might think, is at odds with this. I mean, is that something you would recognise, that a very organised mind and a very logical mind and well-ordered mind is likely to be less creative than one that's a little...
I'd like to make some distinctions here. What I value about art, painting, music, and poetry is that it surprises me, and the surprise comes from a non-linearity or a non-predictability, and yes, a certain disorganization that it requires. We value serendipity, it's what makes poems and other art interesting, but I mean, there is a certain amount of organization in your mind. I mean, after you write a poem, you want to be able to find it again, and when you sit down to write one, you want to know where your pen and paper are. If you're scurrying around a huge mess in your home and you just cannot find anywhere anything to write on, you're not going to be a poet. You might end up scrawling on the walls in lipstick or something. Somebody will come by and lock you up rather than publish you if you do it that way.
That's extraneous, though, to the poem, isn't it? There's organisation within the poem. I was very struck by one of your poems. I mean, it's a section of a tripartite poem, and it's about lametta, which is little strips of tinfoil that you see in doorways that spangle. And you write about that and you say, could we dress all utilities in spangles of lametta, revel in the vulgar Italian TV, indestructible attention splatter, the cat bewitching twitch and dangle, the dross, would things be worse or better? Did you have an answer to that question? Because that goes absolutely to the heart of what Daniel's talking about, isn't it? Attention splatter.
Yeah, no, I don't have an answer at all. It's more about posing a question, I think, in poetry. Poetry is interested in opening up areas where competing answers might be found, and you kind of have to...
The fact that you've written a poem about it in such glowing terms rather suggests you think the answer is yes.
Yeah, I mean, the sequence of poems that comes from is called Trimmings, and it was very much an experiment with gathering up basically lots of different sparkly things in terms of language that I found interesting. So there's some very unusual words in that poem, and all the 3 sections are titled after particularly interesting words. I mean, lametta I thought was just a wonderful thing when I encountered it for the first time. And so I was thinking about whether meaningful poems or meaningful creations can come from all of the not obviously meaningful stuff. And I think that's something poets are really interested in, is how peripheral activities and marginalia and the things that might otherwise get left on the cutting room floor can become really significant.
Margaret Boden, this is absolutely at the heart of what you...
Yeah, I mean, in science too, of course, people are looking for new ideas, some of which are coming out of very unexpected places, and as a result, don't get accepted by other scientists for many, many years. I mean, jumping genes, tectonic plates, there's lots of examples of that. I think the processes of coming up with these new ideas can be very, very similar, I think, to those in poetry, but the process, of course, of evaluating them is very, very, very different. And organisation is of a certain sort is much more important. And, so there's a great difference in the sort of things you get as a result in creativity and poetry.
They have to be tested in a different way. Ian Page.
I'm just thinking, Francis, in terms of writing poetry, it seems to me that the pursuit of resonance is more important than the pursuit of novelty. And the idea of creativity being something new is not necessarily... I mean, is creativity the same as imaginativeness? Is it the same as originality? I think it's all complicated.
Novelty is a sort of poisonous word in poetry. It has very negative connotations. It's something gimmicky that you're doing purely because it's not been done before, not because it has any kind of real significance and intrinsic value in itself. This again, I mean, lots of the ideas we work with today in relation to poetry are very romantic and post-romantic. This is something that Coleridge would have made a distinction between fancy and the imagination. Fancy being something that's just novel and just new, and imagination being something that may have some aspect of novelty to it, but it goes a lot deeper than that as well.
So when you find a particularly pithy simile, is that something that you've sought and found, or does it work the other way up? Do they ambush you?
It can go either way. It can go either way, but there always needs to be some... I mean, you were talking about evaluation there, Maggie, and yes, the evaluative processes are very different in the sciences and the arts, particularly the creative arts, but there is still some sense of evaluation going on, and you have to decide, does this simile, for example, actually fit into the poem as a whole? Does it work within the system of the poem that you're creating?
The evaluation is the critical thing, isn't it? Margaret Boden, you use computers to think about creativity, or to explore what creativity might be. People get very hung up on this. I mean, you I think don't think that a computer can at the moment be creative. Am I right in saying that?
It can certainly appear to be creative. It can certainly do things already in some cases, which if a human being did them, we would certainly regard as creative. And it's not whether it can be really creative, with really in italics, is really a philosophical question, not a scientific one. And it isn't a philosophical question that you can answer definitively, because it involves so many, highly controversial concepts like meaning and consciousness and so on. But in terms of coming up with structures, whether they're music or whether they're images or whether they're text, which appear to be creative, certainly up to a point that can already be done. And
we get some help with the philosophy, don't we, though, by thinking about what computers do. You have an example of a computer. There's a computer program called Aaron, and it draws pictures. It doesn't, as it were, it's not taking photographs of things. It's composing from its software, images of people and portraits, which it's come up, as it were, from scratch, according to a set of rules. So that looks as though it's creative, but it can't itself tell whether one's better than another, can it?
No, it can't. And in fact, I don't know of any current program, doesn't mean to say none exist, but I don't know of any current program which can do that, which can actually criticise its own or other structures and decide on which is best. But they have evaluative criteria built into them.
Can I ask you just to speculate? Do you think that's an inherent problem with computers, or just, as it were, a historical problem that we're not yet at the state of technology to make a computer that could do it? Do you think it is conceivable that a computer...
Yes, certainly that's conceivable. I mean, for example, just take a very, very crude example. Suppose you wanted to have a computer program that was coming up with coloured images, and you wanted it to come up with a certain range of colours which you find beautiful, right? Well, quite apart from just putting that in as a rule, which is sort of boring but possible, you could also have the thing learn from your reactions to, blue and green pictures on the one hand, orange and brown pictures on the other hand, which ones you preferred. It could learn to do that, and then it could learn not only to come up with those more often, the ones that you regard as beautiful, but also to accept or reject, pictures with those different colours. So, it's a very simple example.
It is a simple. I suppose anybody listening to that would say, well, the creativity is still external to the computer because it lies in the judgment of that person. Yes. And that's the essential thing.
Well, yes, yes and no. I mean, the computer is coming up with new and valuable structures, if it's working. And it's doing so very often, by itself, in the sense that once the program is written and once you press the button, so to speak, I mean, the computer does it by itself. You're not constantly looking over its shoulder and pushing it to go here or there. So there is a genuine originality and generativity in there. Yes, of course.
I suppose what you
ultimately it goes back to the programmer.
Yes, and essentially what you want to prove creativity in a computer is the computer that comes along and says, well, actually your software was a bit mediocre, so I've changed it. Because I can do something better than that, which is the tricky thing. Daniel Levitin, you wanted to come in.
I would say, I think in principle, computers can be creative, and a simple thought experiment suffices here. So the entire enterprise of neuroscience is trying to figure out how neurons work, when they fire and when they don't, and to characterize the firing. And you can imagine a time where we can build an artificial neuron that replicates precisely what an individual neuron does. You take inputs from the environment, visual, auditory input, inputs from other parts of the brain, and depending on the input, this computerized neuron, the silicon neuron, fires in precise ways. And so maybe after a stroke or brain damage, we go in and we replace one of your neurons with this computerized neuron. And I'd argue that it would be very difficult to tell that the replacement had even been made. But you extend that to replacing entire brain with interconnected neurons. If they're functioning just like real neurons in a real human, why wouldn't it be creative?
You're better equipped to answer that question than me, Margaret Boden.
Well, as I say, you can take that as a scientific question. You can also take it as a philosophical question. As a scientific question, I'd agree with you. It's in principle possible. But a philosophical question involves all sorts of other issues, like, is there genuine meaning in this system? What is meaning anyway? Where does it come from?
Is there understanding, as John Searle would ask?
Yes.
Does the actual technology matter? I mean, we're at a moment now where we seem to be moving from one type of computer, a rather sort of simple sequential type of computer, to quantum computing and sort of parallel processing and all sorts of other new architectures. Is that going to make a difference?
Well, it's already made a difference. I mean, when I said a moment ago that you could relatively easily get a computer to learn the colours that you prefer, actually the sort of computer which would do that would be a parallel processing connectionist machine. With that sort of architecture rather than a more sequential architecture. So yes, there are many different ways of doing this, and many. I mean, for example, and I'm sure Ian knows as much as this about I do, if not more, the sorts of computer programs that generate music. They use different architectures too. I mean, some of them use connectionism as part of the story, but they can't use just that sort of architecture because they also need to follow some very strict musical rules. I mean, you talk about Mozart, whether he was 8 years old or 38 years old, he was following some very, very strict rules.
But when a computer does, computers can produce Mozartian style music, can't they? They can do a pastiche, but are they not just following a set of rules blindly and slavishly, which we wouldn't count as any kind of creativity?
Yes, I think they are. I mean, I'm sure you can create music that sounds to us like we can tell that it's trying to be Vivaldi or it's trying to be Wagner, but it's not going to have those indefined. I mean, I think the essence of a composer and any artist's voice is incredibly hard, maybe impossible to absolutely define.
But one of the components would consist of the ability to break rules.
Yes,
successfully, would it not?
Absolutely.
And is that not something?
Computers can do that too. They already do. I mean, for example, evolutionary computers, for example, some of which are used in music, some of which are used in visual arts. Deliberately break the rules of a style. Randomly make mutations, if you like. And then either the computer itself decides on which are the best ones to use for the next generation, or the artist does, or somebody visiting his studio or the gallery or whatever. So the notion that rules can't be broken by computers is actually not true.
But I guess the breaking of rules is a subjective. Again, there's an element of by breaking this rule, how am I going to make something better?
Yeah, Daniel Levitin.
And I think, as I learned from reading Margaret's work, one wants to make distinctions about various aspects of creativity, and an important one is a distinction between the generation of the initial idea and then the evaluation of it later. So a competent composer may have hundreds of ideas and then in sifting through them decide, well, this one's good and this one's not so good, which you describe in poetry. And you could imagine that computers could generate some intriguing, novel, serendipitous combinations of things, but they lack presently the judgment to go in. We could let the computer start something for us, but we go then in and take out the parts we like, and we...
You make another important point, which is that creativity isn't an on-off switch. It's not either creative or not creative.
No.
It is a slider switch that you have to judge how creative a thing is.
Yes,
not...
and it isn't just a slider switch. There's three switches. I mean, there are three different sorts of creativity, only one of which is putting, familiar ideas together in unfamiliar ways. Another one is exploring a style, again, like Mozart was doing a certain style of music. And actually, it's interesting what you just said, Daniel, because I remember Picasso once said, "Je ne cherche pas, je trouve." In other words, I do not come up with lots of ideas and then look and see which are the good ones and which are the bad ones. I don't produce any bad ones. Now, actually, the program that Tom was talking about, Aaron, it never produces an unbalanced picture because quite early, actually, in the process, it's got a way of judging where it's going to put the next mark, which ensures that it will never come up with an unbalanced picture.
That's how it would fail the Turing test for a real artist, wouldn't it? Because we know that the way an artist's career work. I mean, you are exploring this very much at the moment, Ian Page. You've just started this extraordinary enterprise, which is a 27-year project to present Mozart works on the anniversary of their first playing or their composition. You're very optimistic about arts funding.
Yes, about my longevity. Yeah. I mean, I think the idea goes beyond things like that. For me, the most important thing is the sequential. Again, it's organisation. Actually, it's the presenting things sequentially, but particularly the notion of context. I mean, I find we've done quite a lot of Mozart's early works, and he was writing operas at the age of 11. He was writing incredible things at the age of 14. And of course, there is the counter argument is, well, you listen to 14-year-old Mozart and you say, well, it's not as good as Marriage of Figaro. And for me, that's totally not the point. And actually, we launched the project last week with a concert of entirely of music written 250 years ago. And the audience afterwards was saying they were really bowled over by the variety of music written in 1765.
You're starting with his visit to London, in fact,
yes,
when he comes to London. Now, did it matter to his creativity that he was here rather than, say, Prague or Vienna? Was there something specific here that he got that he couldn't?
I think there would have been something specific wherever he'd been, but London was, it was the biggest city in the world, it was the wealthiest city, and it was able to, because of the wealth, it was able to bring Italian composers, German composers, and it was a sort of Manchester City of the musical world. Everybody, they could afford to bring people over. And he learnt a lot. He really soaked up a lot of stuff. And in fact, next month we're presenting a whole load of music from operas that were done in London when he was here, which we don't know for sure, but he very probably would have heard. Yeah. And they all just sit in the British Library. Nobody's actually been through this process of digging them out.
Now, one of the explanations for that, if you listen to them again, would be, well, actually, the British Library is where they need to be.
Yeah.
Did you find that, or have you?
I found that it definitely benefits from sifting. I've been through well over 200 arias and we've ended up with 25, and that obviously is, I wouldn't want to impose all my findings on an audience.
You were doing the first modern staging of J.C. Bach's Adriano in Syria, so you obviously think that's worth doing
completely,
at length.
And I think one of the things is that nowadays musical instruments have been built to be bigger and louder. Opera houses and concert halls are bigger, and these 18th century pieces have a real sense of intimacy that are lost if they were done in a 3,000-seater.
Did that particular piece of music happen? I know that Mozart was very fond of J.C. Bach and admired him greatly. Is there a specific kind of connection between?
Well, for me, J.C. Bach's music sounds more like Mozart than any other of Mozart's contemporaries.
We can actually hear a little bit, can't we? We can hear a little duet, so people can judge that. I think I'm right in saying that was first premiered exactly 250 years ago today
in London.
Now, do we know that Mozart heard that, or it's just likely
it's
that he did?
Incredibly likely. Well, it's almost inconceivable that he wouldn't have attended a performance.
One of the fascinating things about the musical culture that you described at the time is that it is, of course, almost entirely recently composed music.
Yes.
It's not a culture which has classical music and then modern music. It's almost all modern music, as far as Mozart's concerned. Does that, do you think, enable him in a different way? Make it seem more possible for
Well, I guess he didn't write music for the future in the way that even Beethoven a few decades later did. So he responded to commissions and he wrote what was required. Within that, there was a wide variety of playfulness and creativity. There's a Haydn symphony actually that we did a couple of years ago that really resonated with me for a rather banal reason in a way. The minuet and trio of that symphony was written by Haydn to be an exact musical palindrome. So the players are instructed to play the music and then to read it entirely backwards, and it fits. And as a puzzle, it's an extraordinary feat of engineering musically. But what really fascinated me was, why did he set himself that challenge? Nobody asked him to. It's ridiculously difficult. And just this idea of creativity being forced by rigidity of rules is
you use the word forced, but of course it may be supported as well. Do you not get that sense with the Mozart's First Symphony? Nobody would claim that it's his greatest or anything like. But he's capable of beginning to do that because there's a set of formal rules in place which he can use for support. You have training wheels, if you will.
And there's a lot of talk about Mozart's genius being God-given, and in some respects it appears like that. But at the same time, absolute technical grounding is what enables that to then take off.
In Mozart's case, he's got models. He's got clearly established models and clearly established. You write, Francis Levitin, about being enormously influenced by Sylvia Plath when you were starting to write poems. Was that a thing about technique, or was it about subject matter? Were you learning lessons about technique from her?
Definitely technique. I mean, I think there's something about Sylvia Plath that appeals to every adolescent girl out there who encounters her work. Something about, the intensity of it that seems to match the intensity of the feelings that you were experiencing as a young woman at that age. So there's always that draw of the emotional charge of the poems and the content. But I think as a young poet, I was incredibly interested in the forms and her and her technical prowess. The poems are incredibly sharp and incisive. And there's just this radiant kind of luminous clarity. It takes
us back to this kind of balancing act between novelty and control. You write about Mozart as having a high internal locus of control. Daniel Levitin, I don't know whether he's been described like that before, but that's the same thing, isn't it? That you can absolutely discipline your talent.
Yes, and I think the interesting thing about Mozart, of course, that we don't want to lose sight of, is that he had probably the greatest music teacher in the world at the time as his teacher, Leopold.
Absolutely.
So, there's enormous structure in his training.
And also in a time when travel was very difficult, he was travelling Europe and being introduced to lots of subtly different schools.
Right. That's how to make a creative mind. Simple, really, if you can do it. Thank you to all my guests. We've run out of time now, I'm afraid. Daniel Levitin's The Organised Mind is out now, and Francis Leviston's new collection, Disinformation, is going to be published next week. Margaret Boden will be giving a public lecture about art and computers at the LSE in London on Thursday, and Ian Page is conducting a series of concerts with classical opera to mark Mozart 250. You can find the details on our website. Next week, the rise of Islamic State. But for now, thank you and goodbye.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free. Thank you for listening to this download of Start the Week, presented by Tom Sutcliffe.
Hello. 250 years ago in Chelsea, a bit quieter then than it is now, an 8-year-old boy's instrument practice began to annoy the neighbours. So, instead of playing music, he decided to write some instead. The opening bars of Mozart's First Symphony, early evidence of a prodigiously creative talent. What exactly do we mean by creativity, though? What balance of the familiar and the new, of rule-following and rule-breaking, of organisation and disorganisation, marks out the genuinely creative mind? That's what we're talking about this morning, as well as how to keep even the least creative mind focused on the job at hand. With us to help are Margaret Boden, a professor of cognitive science who uses computers to better understand human creativity, Ian Page, artistic director of classical opera, and the poet Francis Leviston, an advocate and beneficiary of creative serendipity. We begin, though, with Daniel Levitin, professor of psychology, behavioural neuroscience and music at McGill University in Canada, and the author of The Organised Mind. Your book, Daniel, begins with this idea: the need for paying attention to how we pay attention is greater than ever. Why?
Well, Tom, I think we all feel as though we're being asked to do more than ever before, and that we're being bombarded by information and tasks that weren't in our lives before. Just as an example, we take radiation versus surgery, and it's rigged so that one choice is clearly better than the other. The people who had been put through these trivial decisions did much worse at making an important decision because they had literally depleted neural resources necessary for good decision making. We call it decision fatigue.
That's one of the essential points, isn't it? There's an economy here. All of these little tiny brain activities cost.
Yes.
They cost in energy. Now, could you imagine, just to explain the mechanism of that, if you imagine a listener now at home trying to concentrate on this programme, what mechanisms permit that and what is happening in the brain chemistry to allow that to happen?
Well, at the lowest level, it's important to recognize that neurons are living cells with a metabolism. They need energy to function. That energy is generally in the form of glucose. And the neurons burn
between really important decisions and really trivial ones, that they're not quite up to making that distinction. So we have to find some other way of sorting that out. Is that right?
That's exactly right, Tom. So it's not that your brain doesn't know the difference between an important decision and an unimportant one, but your neurons, which are doing the work, use up about the same amount of energy making a trivial decision as an important one. There was a very clever experiment done where people were asked to make a bunch of trivial decisions. You come into the laboratory, you're going to fill out a questionnaire. Do you want to use a green pen or a blue pen? Oh, we've got some gum. Do you want spearmint or peppermint? And, oh, by the way, we can give you the test on white paper or on yellow paper. After a series of these different trivial questions, people open the packet and they're asked to make very important decisions. Suppose you have cancer. Here's the outline of a treatment course of radiation. 175 times the equivalent of 175 newspapers every day. 5 times more information than we did in 1986 every day. We are living in a world with 300 exabytes of human-made information. That's a 300 with 18 zeros after it. Google estimates there were only 30 exabytes just a few years ago. So in the last few years, we've created more information than in all of human history before us.
Of course, that information is all there potentially. We don't have to pay attention to it all, do we?
But it does bombard us. It does seem to come at us from all different sides. And so you're exactly right. I think the key to navigating this fire hose of information is to get out of the mainstream of it and somehow take what you need, but not get knocked over by the rest of it.
And now one of the points of your book is that the decision-making networks in your brain don't distinguish between